So I want to say a few things by way of introduction about the situation that led us to take this event online. The first thing to say is that the response to the event was overwhelming. So we quickly realized that there wasn't a room on campus that could accommodate this many people. And then the second thing was that we began to receive ominous threats and various forms of harassment and intimidation and so forth, which made us realize that keeping the event in person on campus would have made let's say management of a discussion much more complicated and difficult and challenging and needlessly so. So the first thing I want to say, just by way of preface to all of this, is that we are all, at least the five of us who are running this event, are, and I know many of the people in the audience as well, are members of an academic community. We are faculty at a major research university. And for there to be an environment in which scholars at a major research university are harassed for speaking whatever it is that's on their mind to speak about makes the function of the university essentially untenable. And that's kind of where we are now. That's one sort of in general, kind of general statement about the situation that we find ourselves in. The second statement is that, of course, this is not an event about, I don't know, theories of education or my work on William Blake or, physics or whatever. This is an event specifically connected to Palestine. And so we find ourselves in a situation yet one more time, and I'm old enough to remember this going back for decades now. We find ourselves yet one more time in a situation where people trying to speak about Palestine, people trying to address the history and culture and question of Palestine writ large, face various forms of interdiction and intimidation or attempted intimidation. We're not intimidated, but attempted intimidation and forms of disruption and so on and so forth. And so what I want us to think about as we conduct this conversation tonight is, what is it exactly about the question of Palestine that so many people find so threatening and so alarming to them, that merely allowing a conversation to take place among scholars seems to be worthy of whipping up a kind of storm of anxiety and fret and threats and various other forms of disruption. So I think it's worth thinking about that for a little bit. Um, the second thing that I think I want to focus on is the broader context for this, for what's happening now. In order for us to be able to discuss the situation, we have to be able to respond to what's happening on the ground in Palestine, partly as human beings, that is, people who some of us have family in Gaza, and so we're alarmed at seeing what we're seeing. And even those of us, I don't have family in Gaza personally, I'll speak for myself, but I'm nevertheless alarmed at seeing in literally entire city blocks being removed from the surface of the earth with everybody in the buildings that are being removed, right? And I'm alarmed at seeing what's happening. And so there's a kind of there is, I think, an inherent, let's say, an emotional category, an emotional charge to witnessing these events as they're unfolding. But on the other hand, we're also scholars, and our job as scholars is to be able to situate these kinds of events, to locate them, to talk about them, to understand where they came from and what they're about and where they might go, and so on and so forth. And I think it's imperative for us to be able to have those kinds of conversations. So what we're hoping to do is to have a conversation tonight, not just among ourselves, although also among ourselves. And then we welcome questions and answers, and our colleague Chris Jadala will be monitoring the Q&A and helping us get questions to us. But I'm going to begin by talking about this, the context of the immediate circumstances of the crisis in and around Gaza, in relationship to the colonial context that's which is what it is. And then my colleague Sherene is going to talk us through the wider dynamics of colonialism and racial dynamics and so forth. And then our other colleagues will join in, possibly in the Q&A if things come up that that they can help us navigate and help us think through. I want to begin by talking about the situation, because I think what's really important is that when we talk about Gaza, there's a tendency, let's say, to think about the situation in Gaza and to think about the Palestinian people in particular as somehow exceptional, somehow, like there's something that makes these people react in a way that no other people in the history of the world has reacted, whether for good or for ill or for right or for wrong, isn't the point right now. It's to understand how people act. And but if you put the events that are unfolding now in Palestine in a larger context, historically speaking, you can start to actually make sense of this, right? You can start to make sense, whether you like it or not, whether you approve or disapprove it. That's not the point. Whether you think it's justified or unjustified or whatever, that's not the issue. The issue is to understand the context that produced the situation that we're now seeing unfold. And so I want to zoom in on the particular circumstances that led us to where we are now, and then kind of zoom out from that a little bit to consider the broader colonial dynamics that are in play. The immediate context for what's been happening. I'm not going to get into the whole history of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 and the occupation since 1967 of the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem and the West Bank. We can get into that later. I mean, I'm going to kind of take that historical those historical conditions more or less for granted. I'm not even going to say that much about the particular circumstances of the occupation of Gaza since 1967. I'm going to take for granted even the fact that there has been an intense siege on Gaza since 2005. And I want us to zoom in on the nature and circumstances of the siege that's been imposed on Gaza since 2005. And here I want to draw your attention to the claim that's often made, and it's made and it's repeated in the media all around us to this very day, that somehow the Israelis are not any longer occupying Gaza, that they're outside of Gaza and therefore they're no longer an occupying power. And I want to remind you that according to international law, including according to the United Nations Security Council, Israel, in fact, it remains, legally speaking, the occupying power. And so that therefore, when we read about, as we often do in the mainstream media, when we read about a war between Hamas or even between Gaza and Israel, it's not a war. This is not a situation of war between two sovereign states. This is a situation in which there is an occupying power that is in conflict with the people on whom it has imposed a military occupation. If you don't understand that, you might as well be talking about the moon. It's impossible to understand this situation without understanding that. So begin with that. Begin with Gaza being encircled, cut off from the outside world effectively. All points of input, output, people, anybody coming, anybody going, any goods entering or leaving Gaza are all subject to Israeli interdiction, and they have been very strictly since 2005, 2006, basically unremittingly. And of course the Israelis control access to Gaza through land, sea, and air, which is why the UN, among other forces, considers the Israelis still to be an occupying power. Um, I now want to take you to the design behind the framework of what the Israelis call separation from Gaza, and the circumstances that led to the siege that was basically imposed on Gaza since basically the mid 2005, 2006. Everybody knows, I think, or you can more or less take for granted, that the person responsible primarily for what the Israelis call their disengagement from Gaza, even though, as they've already said, it's not really disengagement because Israel remains the occupying power, legally speaking, because it controls all land, sea, and air access to Gaza. Um, but the person responsible for it was the then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. But Sharon was advised by a team of people inside Israel. Above all, most prominent among them is a demographer at the University of Haifa, a guy called Arnon Sofer. And so Sofer is a demographic alarmist. He's interested in, he's kind of, I think, obsessed with the what he calls the demographic balance between Jewish and non-Jewish inhabitants of Israel, and really of all of what we call historical Palestine, including the occupied territories, but especially pre-1948. In other words, the state of Israel as it's been declared. Um, and so of course, what he's concerned with is maintaining Jewish numerical superiority. That's his, as a demographer, that's his obsession. That's what he writes about. Just like I write about the poetry of William Blake, he writes about maintaining a certain demographic balance, and in particular, a numerical superiority of Jews to non-Jews inside the state. And so he's the one who helped Sharon in this moment in the mid 2000s establish the terms under which Israelis could withdraw their remaining settlements from Gaza and their soldiers that had been stationed inside Gaza to the outside of the territory, seal it off from the outside world, turn it into basically a giant prison, and effectively throw away the key. And this is what Sofer says in an interview with an interviewer in the Jerusalem Post. He says we basically have to think about what we need to do to maintain this, as I said, the superiority, the superior numbers of Jews to non-Jews inside the state of Israel. What he says is a state, and I'm quoting him here. This is an interview that he conducted in the Jerusalem Post in November 2004. A state with an overwhelming majority of Jews, he says, requires violence. And he says, in order to maintain this superiority, and he's talking here about keeping an extra 2 million Palestinians removed from historical Palestine and kept in this gigantic open air prison called Gaza, as he's designing it in the mid 2000s. What he says is, we will have to use violence. There's basically no escape. There's no way around this. There's no escape from it. And I'm quoting him again here from this interview in the Jerusalem Post. He says, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. And then his interviewer is sort of, in the Jerusalem Post, is sort of shocked at this statement. Not many people say we have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day, very calmly and methodically. And so she says, really, we have to kill and kill and kill. And he says, yeah, we'll have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. He continues, the only thing that concerns me is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings. Right? And again, the interviewer is sort of alarmed at this, and he says, look, when we leave Gaza, and you're going to have, and I'm quoting him again here, 2.5 million Palestinians in a walled-in Gaza, it's going to be a catastrophe. He says those people, I'm quoting him from this interview in the Jerusalem Post, those people will become even bigger animals than they already are today, which is why we're going to have to kill them. But the point of killing them, he says, is to maintain this numerical superiority of one ethnicity to another inside the borders of the state, or inside the parameters of the state. And so I want us to think about, what's being said here. I mean, this is the man who he's the architect of the plan to isolate Gaza, lock it up, throw away the key. He's perfectly clear that to wall in two plus million people in a tiny coastal strip, one of the most densely populated places on the surface of the earth, will produce a catastrophic situation in all terms, socially, economically, politically, and otherwise. And it will produce basically a condition of untenable violence. And for us to contain the violence, as he says, we're going to have to kill and kill and kill all day and every day. And as again, to quote him, the only thing that matters to him is how the people who are going to do the killing are going to be able to go home at the end of the day and be normal people, be with their families and so forth. So I think when you see something like this from the architect of this plan, you start to understand the circumstances under which Gaza has existed since 2005, never mind since 1967, 1948, going back to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. The circumstances in which Gaza exists are circumstances of existential violence. Those are the circumstances that take place when one power imposes itself on another people in another territory under the terms of which the Israelis have imposed themselves on the coastal strip of Gaza. It is, and as I said, the architect of this plan himself says it is inherently violent. It will fundamentally require violence. Now, here's as we start to zoom out a little bit here, what I want to point out is if we go forward in time, we move forward in time from this mid 2000s period that Sofer is talking about to where we've been since 2009, 2014, 2021, and on to the present. We're talking about layers upon layers upon layers of violence, which are existential. That is, in the nature of what it means to be in Gaza today, is to be subjected to violence, small scale, large scale, mid scale, it takes all forms. And I want to remind people here, especially under the circumstances that we're witnessing today, people's attention gets drawn when there's large scale violence, people being killed or rockets going off or bombs being dropped or huge explosions on the television. Of course, that is all violence. And I personally am against that kind of violence visited on civilians. But violence takes many different kinds of forms. It's not just large scale violence involving explosions, rockets, and bombs. Violence can also take a small scale. It can be slow and even at the level of an individual person kind of violence, right? So, for example, a cancer patient who can't get treatment for her cancer because she can't get out of Gaza and who therefore dies as a result of what would otherwise be a perfectly treatable or curable disease, and cancer is only one case in point here, dies as a form of violence, as a form of colonial violence, right? Children who can't receive an education because they're cut off from the outside world are subjected to pedagogical violence. Families who can't leave Gaza, in fact, you have to remember, an entire generation of Palestinian children has grown up in Gaza unable to leave the territory. As I said, everything that comes in and goes out of Gaza is controlled by the Israelis. That form of pressure on 2 million people, even if it's on 6 people, is all of it constitutes violence. As I said, large scale or small scale. So the conditions of possibility for talking about the Gaza Strip today, and this goes, by the way, it goes for the rest of Palestine, it goes for the West Bank, it goes for the rest of pre-48 Palestine, it goes for Palestinian life in general. It's all subject to violence. Now to zoom out a little bit, that's because colonialism itself is a violent construct. It has always been a violent construct. There is nothing remotely unusual about the situation in Palestine in terms of the violence that colonialism entails. Colonialism has always been and will always be a violent endeavor. When one people is trying to impose themselves, their will, their identity, their desires on another people, that will always require violence. The kind of violence involved is clear to somebody like Sofer, who's a demographic planner for the current Israeli state. The kind of violence required was obvious to the early planners of the Zionist state, going all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s, when it was very, very clear to early Zionists that the indigenous population of Palestine had to be removed because it was mostly Muslim and Christian, and therefore would be in the way of a state that wanted to have a singularly Jewish identity. And so therefore, from as early as the 1920s and 1930s, when Palestinian Muslims and Christians composed 93% of the population of historical Palestine, Zionists were already talking about transferring this population, getting rid of it, removing it, which obviously nobody's going to leave their homeland voluntarily. To remove people from their land requires violence, right? So this is what I think we need to bear in mind, right? And I'm not necessarily, I'm not saying, I'm talking about the conditions of violence that we're witnessing here, and that they beget more violence. And there shouldn't be any surprises. If you look at other colonial contexts, other colonial situations, other uprisings against colonial violence, they're violent. If you look, for example, I happen to be a scholar of British literature and culture. If you look at the reaction among British people in the middle of the 19th century, humanitarians like, for example, Dickens and others like him, in the middle of the 19th century, to what was called by the British the Indian Mutiny of the 1850s, the British were shocked at the level of violence produced by the Indian uprising in the middle of the 19th century. They're saying, how could these people do this to us? How dare they do this? It's outrageous that these people are inflicting such violence on British men, women, and children in the middle of India, or in fact, all throughout India, in this uprising in the middle of the 19th century. But of course, what people like Dickens weren't connecting the dots, and the dots that had to be connected was that the Indians didn't wake up one day and embark on a rebellion against British rule because they felt like it. They embarked on a rebellion against British rule because they had been subjected to British rule for the previous, at that point, 150 odd years. Right? Colonialism involves violence. The resistance to colonialism involves violence. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying I like it, or I'm not saying I dislike it. It is a matter of fact. Anywhere you look in the history and the annals of colonialism, you will see violence, because that is what colonialism is about. And therefore, to the many of you in this room, I have no doubt, who want the violence to stop, who want all of the killing to stop, I certainly do. What we have to understand is that if we're going to stop the violence, we have to stop the conditions out of which the violence emerges. And those conditions are the conditions of colonial settlement, of colonial occupation and apartheid. If we want the violence to stop, we have to stop those conditions. Those conditions are what produces the violence. Those conditions are what, as its architects themselves admit, say, confess perfectly freely in the pages of the Hebrew press in Israel, those conditions fundamentally require violence. So if we want to end the violence, we have to end the colonial circumstances producing the violence. And I certainly believe in an end to occupation, an end to colonialism, an end to apartheid. And I believe, and I firmly believe, and I've been saying this for 20 or 30 years now, I believe in a state that treats all of its citizens equally and that treats people equally, irrespective of their ethnic, religious, or other kinds of backgrounds. That's the kind of state that I think we should move towards. And we could talk more about whether or not that's possible, what the current events tell us about those kinds of movements. I'll hand off now to my colleague, Sherene Razack.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here at this teach-in. I wanted to offer a few comments about the racial context of colonial occupation. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger once observed, "Only man dies, the animal perishes. Those who are imagined as non-human do not die, they only come to an end. To die, one must be thought capable of death, in contrast to animals in the Western tradition anyway, who simply perish because they are not considered capable of dignity. In the same way, Palestinians perish, and now for many people, justifiably so. Their deaths are not grievable. Only Israelis die and can be mourned. Make no mistake about it, all death must be grievable. All violence must be condemned. Yet this is not what we're hearing. We hear instead about US resolutions to support the brutal blockade in Gaza, about which you just heard. We hear about incitement for Israeli war crimes in Gaza. The Israeli government is absolutely clear about its intentions to kill as many Palestinians as possible. Genocide cannot be the answer to anything. Many people have urged us, amidst all the threats we've been getting, and you can see in the chat, some have urged us that we must be fair and talk about Hamas's terror attacks. This teaching is precisely about terror, and apparently on both sides. Certainly the abominable attack perpetrated by Hamas, but the abominable acts of terror perpetrated by Israel over the past 56 years. But if it is focused on a side, if you want to call it that, then it is on how it comes to be that the genocidal violence of an occupying power is not on the table. Many of us will be sanctioned for merely raising the question at a time when extraordinary violence is encouraged and authorized against Palestinians. So to get to the question of both sides, we really have to begin with why one set of lives are not grievable. How do Palestinians come to be so locked into the category of the non-human, the category of animals, as they're often referred to in formal Israeli discourses, again, most recently by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? It is critical to understand the occupation of Palestine within the broader context of European colonialism and white supremacy. This helps us to understand the near total response of the US and the West to the situation in Gaza as a situation that has no context and that comes out of the blue and that is only about barbaric terrorists killing innocent Israelis. Nothing colonial is happening here. Crimes against humanity may continue apace in the name of vengeance. How do we understand the role of whiteness and white supremacy in colonial projects the world over, and in Israel in particular? How do we understand Western support for this colonial project? So to make sense of these calls that we're hearing, and it's being undertaken as we speak, for genocide, I'd like to introduce some thoughts about what fuels calls for genocide. And specifically, I want to think about anti-Muslim racism and white supremacy. This is a topic I examine in my book, Nothing Has to Make Sense. I want to start with Christianity and whiteness, because I think it sheds some light on the current situation. Islam is poised to overrun Christian Europe is a very old narrative. It is a narrative that packs a very specific emotional, and I would maintain, racial punch. The brutes are after us again. The narrative installs Europeans as a single group, as civilized and both racially and religiously different from all that is imagined to threaten white Christendom. Christianity, even in its secular garb, somewhat of a contradiction, is always tied very tightly in with whiteness and Europeanness. Religion becomes knotted with racial significance. There is a long-standing relationship between whiteness, imperialism, and Christianity that is at play in the colonization of Palestine. Specifically, you can see this relationship in the phrase, the God-given right to the land, which is the God-given right to colonized, racialized others. This relationship has been central to how the European world accepts the colonial occupation of Palestine. I need not remind you that Palestine, famously understood by Zionists as a land without people, depends upon the colonial construction of Palestine as a place that needed to be under occupation because its inhabitants belong to pre-modernity and do not form a recognizable collectivity. Here we can glimpse the critical connection between whiteness and property. Only the civilized are entitled to the land. And even more fundamental, as W.E. Du Bois put it, the logic is that Europe must administer the darker world for its own good. Christianity itself, and later a Judeo-Christian alliance, comes to be associated with rationalism, science and reason, capitalist economy and political democracy, all of which is foregrounded and given content by the idea of Muslim despotism and an inferior Orient. This is the colonial fantasy we see undergirding the narrative that what is happening now is to be understood as a brutal people rising up against a superior civilization. This is a fantasy that has no place in it for the brutalities of colonial occupation, for massacres of Palestinians, for the open-air prison we call Gaza, for an apartheid system. You will see that Israel is represented in the mainstream press and everywhere, not as a colonial power and apartheid state, but as a democracy, one that is even described as having been benevolent to the refugees who make up 70% of Gaza. I saw that in the New Yorker recently. It's useful to recall here the making of the global color line when whiteness became the basis of geopolitical alliances in the early 20th century, right around the time that the Balfour Declaration handed over Palestine to Zionists. White nations constituted themselves as an international imagined community, alarmed about a rising tide of color. White identities became sutured in a global frame as civilized peoples who are imagined to be menaced by an Islamic other, among other racialized threats. Palestinians have no chance of being legible as part of an anti-colonial movement against occupation because they are simply the Islamic other. We should remember here how much colonialism depends on the power of racial affect, the emotions that enable racial fantasies to flourish. How else to feel white, to feel innately superior and utterly entitled to the land, amidst all the anxieties and contradictions that come with theft of land and the violence required to keep it? One must feel that one is menaced by a barbaric Islamic other. Palestinians, who must also defend themselves against a brutal colonial occupation, is an impossibility in this colonial fantasy. In the world today, white states, and indeed many other states of the South with a similar supremacist bent, I'm thinking here of India and even China with its treatment of the Uyghurs, can label anyone with whom they are in conflict as terrorists and extremists. Islamic terrorist is one of those magic words that authorizes violence. The designation of a global Islamic enemy as a race takes us on a very long road that involves torture, war, occupations, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. The jihad fighter is a universal enemy, as Dara Lee has shown. Israeli soldiers enforcing an occupation based on the idea that God gave the land to Jews are not, however, to be seen as jihad fighters. Christianity plays an important part in how white identity emerges in the United States and elsewhere. In the United States, as settlers who sought divine sanction for dispossession and slavery and declared that white supremacy mandated the occupation of the land, it is not surprising that whiteness has such a frontier aesthetic about it. Aggressive, gun-toting white men must protect the land from savagery. American national security is often rooted through the case of Israel and Palestine, two settler societies who depend upon the notion of white entitlement against an indigenous racialized other. Two countries that must repeatedly engage in the drawing of civilizational racial lines in order to protect white property interests. The figure of the Muslim has always simmered beneath the surface of white Christian identity, and it is, of course, especially intense among Christian evangelicals, prompting, among other things, campaigns to ban any mention of Islam in the school curriculum, but crucially, campaigns to protect Israel at all costs. Muslim in the Christian evangelical imaginary are the illegitimate occupiers of the Holy Land, and the return of Christ cannot come about unless Jews return to the Holy Land and rebuild the Temple of the Mount in Jerusalem, eradicate Muslims, and then convert. This is the scenario of the rapture. In the wake of this weekend's events, evangelical theologians have trumpeted these ideas loud and clear. The startling but important thing about the notion of the rapture is how much it takes hold, how much it is a belief that rides in on racial feeling. A religious claim hitches a ride on an imperial one. Settler narratives about entitlement to the land are secured through religion, what the scholar Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian calls the sacralization of politics. Simply put, a religious claim of the settlers' God-given right to the land is anchored in racial feeling. The settler project is understood as a civilizational battleground between a modern and a pre-modern people. It is, of course, very hard for Jews to be included in this white family. Anti-Semitism frequently evicts them from this very select club. But the occupation of Palestine is one ticket into the club, since Jews must drive out Muslims and occupy the land of Israel before the rapture can occur. The defense of Christianity requires white militias and guns. Likewise, the defense of Israel requires violence, as Sari has shown. This defense is always legitimate because it is a defense of the superior side of the civilizational line. It is a racial narrative that is boosted by religious feeling. As scholars of Christian Zionism have shown, the evangelical subject is deeply invested in the idea of Western white superiority. Such scholars also tell us that Christian Zionist belief in Armageddon, when Jesus returns to earth, is not metaphoric. A very large number of evangelicals believe it, making a racial fantasy dressed up as religious obligation. So we must begin to understand the widespread refusal to see that Palestinians die and do not simply perish. We must understand this through a racial lens, understanding settler colonialism as a racial project of accumulation. I'll turn it over next to Lubna.
I think Noor is going to tell us a few things to give us an update, and then Lubna. Noor?
Yeah, thank you so much, Seti, and thank you, Sherene, for giving us a sort of wonderful, some historical colonial background, as well as theoretical background on racialization and applying it to Palestine, Israel. I do want, some of these numbers are a little outdated. In a matter of an hour, these numbers change very quickly. But I do want to sort of, before we go into Q&A, also ground us in what's happening right now. So the situation on the ground is quite dire. the last 5 days, over 1,200 Palestinians have been killed, over 5,000 injured, hundreds of whom are children. Israel, as Seti mentioned, has explicitly conveyed a tightening of the already present siege to cut off all electricity, water, and food, and really being very bold in its public statement of genocidal intent and calling Gazans animals, calling Palestinians in Gaza animal. I'm actually quite hesitant to use even the term Gazan. The last power station ran out of fuel this morning, early this morning, California time, 2 p.m. Gaza time. And doctors in Gaza now have issued an urgent SOS to the entire world as generators quickly run out of fuel. They have literally no idea what they are going to do when ICUs begin to shut down. And this devastation is, not in regards to destruction of homes and infrastructure is widespread across the Strip. Neighborhoods like Rimal, if you've managed to catch any of the photos in central Gaza, have been totally leveled and look quite like a horror film. And there is not, this time perhaps more than any of the numerous previous wars, not one neighborhood or town that has not been heavily bombed in some capacity. Family in Gaza is quoting to me regularly, sort of relaying to me regularly, that this time more than any other time, it feels like they're hitting things just to hit things for the sake of hitting things. There does not seem to be a particular strategy as there has been in the past. And the Rafah crossing was hit, which is the only way in or out, right, of Gaza, was hit 3 separate times yesterday, with Egyptian aid trucks threatened that if they approached anywhere near the border, they would also be bombed. Mind you, Egypt is a country that has diplomatic relations with Israel and has normalized with them since '73. And we are at a very critical point now. The amount of Palestinians that have been displaced within Gaza outnumbers the number of Palestinians that were displaced in 1948. There are over 250,000 Palestinians that have been internally displaced in Gaza and are homeless now because their homes are rubble and wreckage. If we think about the descendants of the 250,000 refugees of 1948 and how we are now millions, how are we going to look ourselves in the mirror when we ask ourselves the question, what is to become of the descendants of these 250,000 people in Gaza that have been made homeless in the last 5 days? And that is a very real question that we need to grapple with, and we have to push the world to grapple with. The news is now circulating that the US is helping to coordinate space, whatever that means, in Sinai for Palestinians, is outrageous. And, let's be clear, this is not the humanitarian corridor that Palestinians have been pleading for at every war and have been denied during every war, which international organizations have been pleading for. This is a transfer plan. And Palestinians in Gaza recognize that, and they are very suspicious of it. And the first question they have been asking is, can anyone guarantee us that we would be allowed to go back? Palestinians are very aware that once you cross a border, there is a very good chance you never make it home again. And so that's a very real part of this. It's not just the overwhelming death and destruction in Gaza that's happening right now. It's also a matter of questions of transfer as a part of this ethnic cleansing. And the scenario continues to widen by the hour. And Israel has essentially promised that a ground invasion is coming. So, it is on us not only to speak to each other and to educate each other, but to put pressure on our governments wherever we may be, that this is not acceptable. This is not what we want our tax dollars to be aiding. And I encourage everybody, as sort of was mentioned earlier, and I'm not sure if the audience can see other people's comments in the Q&A, but I would encourage everybody also to check your media sources. This is something we can talk a bit about in the Q&A, perhaps. The journalistic integrity, or lack thereof, I should say, of reporting has been deplorable. It's as if nothing was learned from the war on Iraq. Media is relaying rumors and then detracting unsubstantiated claims after the fact, after all the damage has been done and the rumors circulated the world 3 times over. President Biden today repeated for the 2nd time unsubstantiated rumors, rumors that the Israeli military themselves have said there is no proof for. And so, you know, please, everyone, check your sources and encourage others to do the same. And if you have contacts, family, colleagues who work in the media, this is a moral responsibility, if you are a journalist, to just basic principles of journalistic integrity, corroboration, and second sources right now.
Thank you, Noor. Lubna, would you like to add, please?
I mean, I think, thank you, Sari and Sherene and Noor, for giving that context, historical, about the current situation, Noor, in Gaza. It's terrifying, really terribly frightening right now. I think I just, you know, I'd like to just speak for a quick moment about the question that many people have, which is, where did this situation come from? I think, you know, Sari gave us more historical context in terms of Gaza earlier, and Sherene gave us the longer historical context. But I think it's very important to sort of think of the last 30 years since the peace process. We, as Palestinians, have a very long history of fighting for our freedom, for our return to our homeland, for our rights, and for our dignity. And in 1993, when the peace process went underway between the official Palestinian leadership, the PLO, and Israeli leadership, there was a promise that Palestinians would achieve a state only on 22% of historic Palestine, right? So in a very, very small state that would sacrifice the refugee right of return, that would sacrifice several of the key questions, right? In the negotiations, there is discussions, all the major issues were sort of deferred for further discussions, but the peace process was signed in recognition for the promise of a future Palestinian state. In the years that followed Oslo, in the 6 years that followed Oslo, that led to the second intifada of the early 2000s, unfortunately, the Israelis annexed more land in the West Bank and at that time in the Gaza Strip to create settlements at a faster rate than what they had done between 1967 and 1993. So this was supposed to be the years of peace, right? The years of these two organized leadership working toward the promise of a two-state solution. So I mention all this because by the time we get to the early 2000s, which you know, is reignited with an armed struggle during the second intifada, the promise of statehood, the promise of a long-lasting solution had already crumbled. And then there was a restoration and a path back toward negotiations between these two Palestinian leaderships that resulted, again, in the decades that followed the second intifada, in an enormous amount of Palestinian land loss, enormous casualties, enormous loss of life. And so for many Palestinians today, whether they're in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, the way they view the operation that's now leading to the retaliation on the Gaza Strip is a natural course of action for people who've exhausted all other means at their disposal. And what I mean by that is Palestinians for over 100 years have been appealing to the international community, have been writing letters, have been doing nonviolent strikes and boycotts and pickets, have taken our experience and written it into books, have taken our experience and made it into songs and music and painting, right? Have done everything in our possible, it means at our disposal to both compel and sensitize the world to Palestinian blood and to the plight of Palestinian people, while at the same time really securing a long, durable, lasting solution that included the rights of Palestinians and their dignity and their freedom. Unfortunately, that patience has run its course, right? That patience has run its course to the point that the last several years has seen a resurgence of Palestinians returning toward the path of armed struggle because it had been a verifiable path that was used in the national liberation struggles in Ireland, in Algeria, and across colonized and third world. And so I think that a lot of people are talking about the surprise and the shock that happened with this operation last week. But it's very important to put it into context that this is the responsibility not only of the colonizers, but of world actors who have actively prohibited a durable solution to this struggle for over 75 years. The way to end the violence, as Seti had mentioned earlier, the way to end this violence, the way in which there can be a long, durable solution is for Palestinians to be granted their rights and freedom. The only other thing that I would say in this moment, the last couple of days, atop of seeing the bloodshed, on top of seeing the pain that so many communities are going through, an emergency genocidal crisis in the Gaza Strip right now, there's also the painful experience of watching how what is happening is being described. This issue did not start on October 7th, 2023. The provocation was not October 7th, 2023. I think what's happening in the way that the media is talking about what's happening right now is illustrating what Sherene was talking about around how Palestinians are not seen as human. The asymmetry in terms of who is afforded humanity is really important in terms of how we are talking about what's been happening. We have seen 150 Israelis taken hostage and for 72 hours. And the entire world, was up in arms. Meanwhile, there have been 2 million Palestinians held captive, hostage in the Gaza Strip for 17 years, and no one has batted an eye. This is not to compare oppression, or it's not an oppression Olympics game. This is to show that there is a certain violence and a certain humanity that is recognizable and another version that is not. And this is very important because a lot of the rhetoric that has been spewed that Noor spoke to, a lot of the misinformation, a lot of the rumors that have been spilled, unverifiable reports that have been circulating, right, are perpetuating the same racialized stereotypes about Arabs, about Muslims, about Palestinians that really galvanized the Islamophobia and the anti-Arab racism right after September 11th, 2001, and that resulted in the slaughter of 1 million Iraqis and millions more Afghan and Pakistanis and Filipinos and so many other people who were lost during the war on terror. So it's very important to understand where we're getting our news source. It's very important to verify our reports. And, I think it's also very important to understand where Palestinians are coming from. We are seeing all of these reports about what's happening in Israeli society, written reports. Meanwhile, we are watching live video footage and pictures taken in real time of Palestinian families in the Gaza Strip pulling their babies out of the rubble. And so there is an asymmetry, not just of the power of coloniality, but there is an asymmetry in the way that we recognize humanity and in the way we condemn violence. And I think this is very important for us to keep in mind as we grieve and mourn the dead, as we mobilize for justice and peace, as we mobilize to stop this war, as we mobilize for the rights and dignity of the Palestinian people, and as we mobilize for world accountability, not just accountability by the Israeli state, but accountability for the international community who is definitely complicit in allowing this catastrophe to last as long as it has, and to claim the lives as many millions of people as it has over the last 100 years.
Thank you very much, Lubna. Our colleague Chris has been, I think, gathering questions for us. Chris, do you have some for us to start answering?
I do, yes. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your perspectives. I'll read some of the questions that came in the written Q&A aloud, and I'll just open those up to anybody who feels compelled to answer. So the first question is, can you talk a bit about Hamas's rise to power within the government in Gaza and how it differs from the leadership and situation in the West Bank?
I can start, and then my colleagues can jump in. I want to say there's a few things to be said about this. One thing that's said, this goes back to something I said at the beginning of my own intervention a few minutes ago, which is that we often read that the Gaza Strip is like it's the Hamas ruled Gaza Strip, but in fact we have to remember Gaza is not a sovereign state, so it's kind of meaningless to talk about an occupied territory being governed by anybody other than the people who are occupying it, basically. So just and that the same goes with the West Bank. Is like the West Bank is not a sovereign state. Both the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem are under military occupation, and there's only one government. For example, like the most banal thing possible, if you want to get your your ID card, for example, or a passport, like any kind of transaction that involves going to the state and saying, hey, I need this kind of document to do thus and such kind of thing, you have to go to the people who have what's called the population registry. And in the case of Gaza, to this very day, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and so forth, the power that holds the population registry is the state of Israel. So nothing can happen, no kind of interaction can take place without it going through the state of Israel. So ultimately, the government that's imposed is the government of the state of Israel. It can be mediated in all kinds of ways, but that's basically what it comes down to. So in that sense, to speak of the Hamas government in Gaza, or the so-called PLO or PA government in the West Bank, it's a meaningless proposition to begin with, because these are not sovereign states. Only sovereign states have governments in the true sense of that term. I'll say that to begin with, and then Paul, I want to add one more caveat to this, which is that when we speak about Hamas itself, and I'm somebody who has very little in common with the ideology and background and mission of Hamas, and for all kinds of reasons. But it's important to bear in mind, Hamas is a creature of the late 1980s, early 1990s, late 1980s, the period of the First Intifada in particular. And we have to remember that the First Intifada took place after 20 years of occupation since 1967, and after 40 odd years of the catastrophe of 1948. So again, this goes back to my earlier point, and point that my colleagues made, in reiteration, which is that we have to remember chickens and eggs, which one comes first. There's a kind of sequence to the events that are unfolding, and we have to bear that sequence in mind. But I'll defer now to my colleagues about this question of Hamas versus the PA.
Before I say anything, Lubna or Sherene, do you want to say anything?
No, go ahead.
I mean, Seti covered this very well. I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that, up until 1987, Hamas didn't even exist. And up until 2006, Hamas was not, quote unquote, in charge of or a governing authority of any kind in Gaza or elsewhere. And the occupation existed in both of those time periods. So, I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that you don't have, we look at a place like the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority and a very subdued leader, to say the least, and Mahmoud Abbas, who was very acquiescent to security coordination with the Israelis, among other things. And the occupation continues. So the idea that Hamas disappears and the occupation disappears is completely false, right? And that's something that we really have to kind of make a point to understand and always keep at the forefront. The other thing is, when Hamas was democratically elected in 2006, the plan, when elected, right, as part of these elections, which were globally recognized by independent observers as being free and fair elections, the plan was never for them to have Gaza and the PA to have the West Bank. They were confined to Gaza because Israel and the West refused to acknowledge and recognize those free elections, and even give 1 week's worth of time to see how Hamas would function as a governing authority. So they were then confined, besieged, and are given even more credence as a resistance party. The militant wing is given more credence as a resistance party when they become confined to Gaza, which is to the benefit, to be perfectly honest, of no one but the Israeli state, because they have been able to further marginalize the Gaza Strip, which prior to Hamas, as early as the mid-1990s, the Israeli state had what is called a Gaza first policy, where the idea was to first marginalize and remove Gaza from the conversation, and then see what they can do to deal with the West Bank. They got their wish in 2005, 2006, 2007, right? So this is not where we are now is very much not a path that Palestinians planned out for themselves or chose for themselves.
I would just add, yeah, thank you both for elaborating on that. I would just add, it's very important to understand that 4 out of the 6 major Palestinian political parties are considered terrorist organizations by the United States and by Israel. But all of the Palestinian parties, the 6 major ones and the smaller ones, are all calling for a return of resistance, okay? Last year's war with Gaza was with the Islamic Jihad. It was not with Hamas. Today's fighting that's happening between the Israeli army and different militant groups in the West Bank includes many different groups, including the Lion's Den, whose origins stem from young people who come from Fatah, which is the dominant party of the PA. The reason I mention this isn't to sort of demonize Palestinians across the board. I mean, if you're here for that, that's what you'll take away from this. I mention this because Israel does not have a Gaza problem or an Israel problem. Israel has a problem with the Palestinians, with the presence of Palestinians in their land, with the refusal of Palestinians to surrender their rights, with the refusal of Palestinians to die quietly, and with the refusal of Palestinians to forget about their right of return. And so we are seeing the narrative the last 20 years extra emphasize Hamas, but before that it was the PLO. And after Hamas, it'll be another organization. It has to do with the consistent cross-generational demand of Palestinians to be free from military occupation and to return. And so regardless of what the name of the organization is, and whether it's a leftist force or an Islamist force or a secular nationalist force, we have seen across the board the blanket violence that has been used against them and the way in which they have been criminalized under the rubric of terrorism and barbarism and all the racialized stereotypes that have been levied against Arab and Muslim and Palestinian communities for decades.
Thank you all. So I want to voice another question from the Q&A, which is, I just wanted to ask if anyone could speak to the connections between Gaza and Ferguson and the Palestinian connection to Black liberation.
Well, on that front, it is easy enough to see that those that are under the same kind of power find community with each other. It's the oppressed holding on to each other. I think the other thing that unites the struggles is that very often the infrastructure that oppresses is the same. I mean, one can take a simple example. It's Israeli weapons and Israeli military training of police forces that deal with Black people in the United States. That's a very direct connection. So there are very profound connections in the struggle, as you know, even as especially, for example, the Black Panthers saw. White supremacy is a global phenomenon. It's a globally organized one as well. So one has to fight from a global perspective, understanding the interconnections between the policies, and they're very direct, very material and very direct.
Oh, did you want to go? I just want to say that the last few days, it's ironic. I've been thinking so much about the debt that I owe to Black mentors and to the Black radical tradition and to the long lineage of Black revolt in the United States. As someone who, you know, grew up in this country, I think that I can say for myself, and I think for many of us, we are introduced to understandings of power and oppression through our introduction sometimes to leaders and histories of the Black tradition before we even know our own, before we even have access to the names of Palestinian revolutionaries or understand where to look for reading about a specific period of Palestinian resistance. We read about Black resistance. And I've been thinking so much about the lessons that have been taught to us, from the writers to the activists to the organizers. I've been thinking about Frantz Fanon's understanding of revolt coming from a moment when people simply can't breathe. I've been thinking about Steve Biko's belief that struggle should be popular. I've been thinking about the teachings of so many Black feminists, that there has to be love that's consistently animating our resistance and our solidarity, right? It can't be driven by hate. And I've been thinking a lot about that this week. Are we as Palestinians driven by hate? I've been asking myself and returning to this idea of the necessity to continue foregrounding love in its animation for our resistance. And so I think on the one hand, there are the quite literal exchanges and solidarities between Black and Palestinian communities, and we're well documented, and there's a lot of people doing artistic work and political work and academic work that illuminates it. But on the other hand, I think if we pay attention to the history of how Black communities have organized and resisted and sustained and survived and continued on, despite how much they were defeated and gaslit and blamed for their own oppression, we can understand what's happening in Palestine today. That's the way I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lubna. Yeah, thank you. I think another thing that I would add, just because the person happened to mention Ferguson, and you're right. I mean, there were conversations directly between happening over social media, and that's been documented. And there are a lot of really wonderful people who have written about that. So I encourage you to sort of pursue that. My lights have turned off. Pursue that line of thinking and reading. And we can look as here in LA, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles put out an incredibly detailed and nuanced statement about the events of the last 5 days. And I would encourage you guys to look that up as well. But I think, the important thing also to realize, and both Sherene and Lubna alluded to this, is that this has quite a long history. This does not start in Ferguson. The Palestinian liberation movement, the Black liberation movement, and liberation movements, anti-colonial liberation movements across the world have been in touch with each other for 5 decades now, and have been talking to each other and learning from each other, particularly right throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. So these are not new connections, but these are revived connections. These are new generations that are reviving old connections and once again learning from each other.
The one thing I would add, I mean, my colleagues have said it more perfectly than I can say it, but I want just the one thing that I can contribute maybe to this particular question is the question of racism itself, to go back to the point that Sherene made earlier. One of the best definitions that I know of even the concept of racism is from the African American geographer Ruth Gilmore Wilson. She says, and it's kind of a complicated sentence, but it's actually worth. I'll read it slowly so that people who don't know it can absorb it, because it's actually a very, very powerful way to think about race, I think. So she says, racism is the state-sanctioned and/or legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. I'll read it again. I know it's a twisty sentence, but listen to it. Racism is the state-sanctioned and/or legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Right? And so when you think about racism in those terms, you can see, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this stuff out. You can see automatically the connection between, for example, the situation of how racial dynamics work in the US and in other contexts as well. And obviously in this particular instance, Gaza, especially Gaza, but really all of Palestine, the power over the capacity for life. Who wields that kind of power? What are the state-sanctioned forces, disciplines, mechanisms, forms of authority, forms of rule, forms of interdiction, and so forth, that allow some people to live and prevent other people's from having full life, and so forth? And I think that concept helps us understand the continuities that bind these different areas of struggle to one another, and that help allow us, as Sherene and my colleagues were saying earlier too, both Lubna and Noor also, allow us to think about and to locate, to place the Palestinian struggle, not just in the history of colonialism, which is what I was primarily talking about, but also in the context of anti-racial struggle too, because that's also what this is about.
Thank you, everybody, for drawing these powerful connections. For the sake of time, we only have one more question that we'll be able to answer aloud. And I think this question builds on this thread that you're all drawing around transnational solidarities. So the question is, didn't America colonize the USA and take the land from indigenous people living here? So should Americans return the land to Native Americans? Do you think casinos are enough as restitution? You are an American and have occupied the land that does not belong to you.
That's really an easy one. Yes, give the land back. It is of interest to note that indigenous groups have never campaigned for all the land back, which is surely their due. But the very little that they ask, stop killing us, give us back the land so that we can live, that is refused consistently across the board. So yes, it is the same response as the response to Israel. Both are settler colonies, and there is, I absolutely stand by what I would like to happen in Israel is what I want to happen here as well in North America. Yes, you cannot continue to set up a society and a state that is premised on the dispossession of certain peoples and crucially on their disposability. And here I think I really want to stress at the end, you can only get your head around disposable people. You can only come to think of a people as disposable because you think they're not people, because you think they're subhuman. There's an intrinsic connection between race and colonialism, between race and dispossession. You can't do these things to people. You can't watch their babies being killed on the news. Well, actually, in America, you're not even showing the Palestinian babies being killed. But you can't watch that and think it's okay unless you think those are not people. So race is absolutely critical to how we have to understand this situation.
And I mean, Sherene put it perfectly. I would just add, it's race, and I mean, as Sherene is saying too, it's also race and claims to land and claims to territoriality, claims to who has the right to claim land, and the old colonial concept of what's known as terra nullius, the idea that this is nobody's land and therefore we can take it, right? So again, when you connect the Zionist catchphrase from the late 19th century that Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land, that idea that there's nobody there, basically not even I mean, they may actually be physically there, but the point is they don't constitute people who have a claim to a land, and therefore we can take their land. It's exactly that same claim that, of course, enabled, as the question is getting us to think about, the claiming the possession or the dispossession of Native Americans, for example, or Aboriginal societies in Australia and so forth. It's that same combination of a concept of terra nullius and a concept of the human animal, if I can quote the Israeli Minister of Defense speaking the other day about the people in Gaza. These are animals, basically. So because they're animals, we can do with them as we wish, because after all, if they were people, we might recognize them, but they're not people, they're animals, so we can exterminate them. It's what Sherene is saying. We're talking here about exterminability, about disposability, and about fungibility, about people who aren't worthy of the name of owning land. And again, that we can go all the way back to John Locke in the 17th century and so forth, and talk about where these theories of land and race came from, and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Sherene, so much for that very direct response, and that was needed to be said. I would also add, in sort of building on what Seti was saying, I always share with my students a very famous quote by General Sheridan in the United States during the massive genocide and ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, that this idea of kill the Indian, save the man, because it is to separate, right? It is the racialization that's happening here. It is to separate Palestinianness from the individual, to separate Indianness, nativeness from this individual. It is to remove them from the collective, right? They can only be seen as human when they are removed from, in the US context, in that particular context with Sheridan, from the tribe, Palestinians can only be seen maybe as human when removed from their collective, when removed from their struggle. But once they are attached to that movement, once they are attached to a collective, once there is an ask, they are no longer recognized as someone worthy of recognition, as a collective worthy of recognition, and that, you know, the settler state is willing to engage with. And so I think that these are very important parallels to draw.
I'll let the panel decide. Do we have time to read a few more questions from the Q&A?
We could do maybe one more, Chris.
Sure. So one of the questions that I think actually builds on maybe what Noor was just sharing, I see the term collective punishment being used by some of the more sober political analysts online. The notion that what is happening to Palestinians is a form of collective punishment for the actions of their Hamas leaders. Punishment implies discipline towards an agent who has knowingly done wrong. How is it that supporters of Israel convince themselves that Palestinians as a collective deserve this punishment? What do they tell themselves about the children being killed? Do they deserve punishment?
You know, you always have to sort of have this intake of breath when you hear people arguing, or you hear on the news, or you hear politicians calmly discussing genocide, calmly discussing that it is, you know, going for blood, wanting more and more and more death, and that is the answer. I maintain again, you can't really get to that position without engaging in some kind of racial feeling, where you don't understand the people before you. I used to think, you understand the people as animals, but actually a lot of people understand that you shouldn't kill animals indiscriminately. Yet they understand that you can kill Palestinians indiscriminately, and Black people, and other people indiscriminately. Today, I was doing a lot of thinking. It came to mind about the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, at the end of the Second World War. It wasn't dropped on Germany, and it was so accepted, a turning point. We casually accept that it is all right to exterminate an entire two cities. How did we get there is the question. And also, we know very well what happens once we get there, which is once you see that principle, that it is all right to do this, then you're lost. There's no turning back. I want to say that there is a lot of talk, both in the chat and elsewhere, of people saying, why don't you condemn Hamas for its killing of Israelis? And no matter how many times we say every life is precious, it still leaves the problem that some lives are not seen as precious at all. And I don't know that I can solve that problem by telling you, I don't think anybody should be killed in this way. I don't approve this violence. This will not be enough for you if this is what is on your mind. I think more on your mind should be, how do we stop the carnage?
I mean, yeah, so well said, Sherene. I mean, what can we add to that? People come to these kinds of events wanting to hear what they already think they know. They want to be confirmed in their beliefs. And so, to go back to what I was saying at the very beginning of our discussion, people don't want to have their beliefs altered or questioned, or to have any kind of threat posed to what they believe, what they take for granted, because it discomforts them. The idea that they might not actually be on the right side makes some people feel uncomfortable, and I think it's very important. This question of, why don't you say this, or what about this, or what about that, and so forth. We're talking about a given situation here. None of us want people to die. I don't want anybody to die. I never want people to die of any kind. I don't care who they are. I don't want people to die. But if we, as I said in my own talk, and my colleagues I think will agree with me, if we want this violence to stop, we have to stop the circumstances that produced it. There's no, otherwise you're going after symptoms, not causes. You have to understand where did all of this violence come from. It comes from the circumstances that produced it, which are the imposition of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, occupation. You want the violence to stop, and the apartheid, and the occupation, and the colonial system that has us where we are right now. Otherwise, there will, as I said, there will always be violence. And so for it to stop, don't start telling me about these people compared to those people. It's all people. So we have to end these circumstances of exploitation. That's what it comes down to fundamentally. I'm going to take this opportunity. Noor and Lubna, do you want to add anything to this conversation? Then I'm just going to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending and for allowing us to have a proper conversation, actually, which is more, I have to say, more than I was expecting us to be able to have, given the environment in which we're holding this conversation. It's being recorded, and we will make this recording will be available on, among other sites, the Racial Violence Hub here at UCLA, and you can find it then. And thank you again to my colleagues, Noor and Lubna and Sherene and Chris, and thanks to all of you for attending, and we'll see you perhaps on another occasion. Thank you, and good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.